keep in mind that the current generation of Gen Z students who are, college, high school, maybe just in the workplace, that's our next generation of lawyers, doctors, judges, senators, pastors, and all the data show that they are tremendously woke. So about 30% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ+.
Wow. Many believe that since the election of President Donald Trump, we are living in a post-woke world. That with a few executive orders, the tide of ideas has turned back and some of these progressive secular ideologies are in retreat. But that is a mistake in so many ways, from laws to practices in secondary education, in counseling, in corporate settings. Quote unquote wokeness remains the prevailing worldview in secular culture. So how can Christians thoughtfully engage this blend of secular ideology when it crops up in church and in everyday life? Hi there, my name is Casey Leander. I am the program manager for Summit, Colorado, and today I am filling in for Dr. Jeff on the Truth Changes Everything podcast. For all you Dr. Jeff fans out there, do not worry, he's doing great, but his voice is completely shot with a cold. So while we wait for him to get better, I am your host for the Truth Changes Everything podcast. And my guest today is Dr. Neil Shenvi, co-author of the book Post-Woke, Asserting a Biblical Vision of Race, Gender, and Sexuality, which we'll get to discuss in today's conversation. Neil has an AB in chemistry from Princeton and a PhD in theoretical chemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. He worked as a research scientist at Yale University and Duke University and has published over 30 peer-reviewed scientific papers. In addition, his writings on critical theory have been published by the Journal of Christian Legal Thought, the Gospel Coalition, Ratio Christi, Liberty University, Law Review, among many others. Join with me in welcoming Dr. Neil Shenvi to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. Dr. Neil Shenvi, welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. It's a joy to have you here. Thanks for giving us the time.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here, and I hope I can answer your questions well.
So among all the things you've done, you were also a homeschool dad. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I'm curious, I was homeschooled and I had an amazing experience. There were just so many things that opened up for us to do. I'm curious, as a homeschool dad, is there a tradition or a routine or a field trip or even like an assignment that you're proud of that you look back on and you're like, nailed it?
I think I love homeschooling. It's been great for us, but I really take pride in my kids' mathematical abilities. That was one of the reasons I homeschooled. I have a PhD in theoretical chemistry, and I was so excited to have them, give them opportunities to go really far ahead in math, as far as they could go, basically, because I can teach up through graduate level math. So it's worked so far. So they have different interests in math, but my oldest took a BC AP Calculus test last year as a sophomore in high school. My 7th grade daughter is, so she's just turned 13 and she's currently starting calculus. So I'm super excited. And all of them are very advanced, but I was super pumped about that because I love math.
You get to buck a homeschool stereotype with that, just making these elite math homeschoolers.
I mean, the bigger stereotype is they're all awkward socially, but my kids are really normal kids, very social. They have lots of friends through co-op and through church. So that's the main stereotype that I'm trying to buck, and I think so far it's going fine.
Right. As if no one is socially awkward in other forms of education.
Yeah, right.
That was always when I would get, wow, you're really normal for a homeschool. And I'd say, oh, thank you. You're too kind. Well, I'm excited to get into your book, Neil. It's called Post-Woke, Asserting a Biblical Vision of Race, Gender, and Sexuality. That's what we get to really dive into on today's conversation. And it's an incredibly important topic to digest. Since the re-election of Donald Trump, it's been easy to feel like wokeness, quote unquote, is somewhat in retreat. A lot of people talked about the vibe shift that happened after his second election. I guess an opening question for you would be, what would you say to Christians who think this is an issue of the past? We beat wokeness. It's over. It's a new day. What would you say to those kind of Christians?
So there's no question that Trump's multiple executive orders when he took office did throw a wrench in the works of wokeness, the march of this woke ideology through institutions, education, government, media, politics, everything, sports, you name it. It did get a setback with Trump's reelection, but it's not dead. That's super naive to think that. So here's some examples. On June 6th, 2025, so almost a year after Trump's reelection, there's an op-ed in USA Today that declared there's no scientific evidence that transgender women athletes have a physical advantage over cisgender women athletes. In other words, there's no evidence, the claim was, that biological men who identify as women have advantages athletically over women. That's not true, but USA Today is claiming it's true. On August 8th, 2025, Nature magazine, this premier science journal in the entire world, had an article entitled Decolonize Scientific Institutions, Don't Just Diversify Them. And it said that dominant science, sometimes called Western science, is rooted in colonization, racism, and white supremacy. And then just one more huge example that I think is on the national stage. In November 2025, New York City elected Zohran Mamdani as mayor. And and the headline in Newsweek magazine was, "Woke is back. Liberals celebrate clean sweep of election victories." And if you look at Mamdani's Facebook social media output, he said things like this: defunding the police is a feminist issue. Women, especially trans women, are disproportionately affected by police violence. And he supports, he calls himself a socialist feminist who supports statewide abortion access funding. He wants to decriminalize sex work, that's prostitution, and defund NYPD. These are all his positions officially. There's all over social media. And then just finally, keep in mind that the current generation of Gen Z students who are, college, high school, maybe just in the workplace, that's our next generation of lawyers, doctors, judges, senators, pastors, and all the data show that they are tremendously woke. So about 30% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ plus. So
Wow.
all that's to say is,
Wow.
You absolutely should not think that wokeness is done. In a democracy, we are at any point 4 years away from President Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or President Gavin Newsom.
Right.
So please don't
Right.
let your guard down. That's very naive.
Right. And, it speaks to the nature of politics, too. Chuck Colson had a line where he said, the kingdom of God will never arrive on Air Force One. Mm-hmm. And so anytime we're tempted to think, okay, one, administration that's conservative on these issues could erase, decades, centuries of, by this point, bad ideas that have been culminating in what we would say is, well, that's an incredibly naive view. So your warning is incredibly pertinent for today's Christians, just as we're studying culture. I wonder, Neil, I want to press into what you would define wokeness as. So it's kind of become this catch-all term that you know it when you see it, you feel the vibe, I guess, of wokeness. In your book, you define it as the contemporary cultural expression of critical theory, a sect of academic ideas that has come to function as a comprehensive worldview. So I'm wondering, could you just expound on that for us? Like, what does that mean?
Good question. When we hear woke, we immediately think of things that are woke, like Drag Queen Story Hour or Blue's Clues cartoon showing a drag queen singing about non-binary beavers. So these are, you see it everywhere. So yes, there is a phenomenon called woke, but many people think it's just kind of this progressive zeitgeist. It's just the thing that's faddish and popular. It's new. It wasn't here 20 years ago. But what we show in the book is that no, wokeness is just an expression of ideas that go back over 100 years, all the way back to the writings of Karl Marx, who was the first true critical theorist. And the critical tradition really spread out from Karl Marx and has been around in academia for decades, if not centuries. So we characterize critical theory as this broad umbrella that today is expressed in four big ideas. So very briefly, the four ideas are: number one, the social binary. So according to critical theory today, society is divided into oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, and a host of other identity markers. So everyone falls into these buckets of oppressor or oppressed. Number two, how are people oppressed? according to critical theorists, they're oppressed by something called hegemonic power. Hegemonic power means the ability of the ruling class, oppressors, whether it's whites or men or heterosexuals or Christians, to impose their values on culture. That is the nature of oppression. And their values and norms and habits and symbols, they get taken for granted as common sense, normal, traditional, maybe even God-ordained, but they blind us to the way that we're all living in this rapidly unjust system which oppresses certain groups. So, well, then how can you escape? If we're all brainwashed into woke ideas, these oppressive ideas, how can we escape? Then the third idea is through our lived experience. So oppressed groups, through their lived experience, can wake up to what's called a critical consciousness or a liberatory consciousness. They can begin to see reality as it actually is, an interlocking web of oppressions. Then the end goal of wokeness, number 4, is social justice, which they have defined as dismantling the systems and structures which perpetuate the social binary. So their goal, their utopia, this vision they have, is of a society with no more oppressive hegemonic narratives, where no one is seen as normal or righteous or natural, that everyone sort of shares power and can live their truth, and there is no more oppression. That's their dream goal, their promised land of milk and honey, and diversity, equity, inclusion. So that's in a nutshell, that's what wokeness ideologically is. We see it expressed in these things around us, like in Black Lives Matter or in defund the police movements or in shout your abortion. There are all these ways in which we see these ideas expressed by people who may not even understand where they're coming from. They may not even understand they've bought into this woke ideology's worldview.
It's felt sometimes more than just imbibed through an intellectual sort of exercise. That's what you're saying. It's in the water. You feel wokeness.
That's right. It's very easy to sort of pick up. It's like, you go into a room, you kind of imitate everyone else's behavior. So you would notice that certain groups are given priority, that they're considered authoritative. You see a scale that, straight white men kind of have to be quiet and silent because they are oppressors. Whereas the more oppression points you have, the greater value is placed on your pronouncements. Well, that's straight up out of this idea that lived experience confers special knowledge. So again, there are a host of ways we see these ideas expressed, and oftentimes people don't read Robin DiAngelo, or they don't read Imrex Kendi, or Kimberly Crenshaw. They just pick up the vibe from their coworkers, from yard signs, from internet culture, social media. They parrot these ideas, even though they haven't really done the reading.
Right. Because it feels almost like you're on the side of, to be on the side of justice, you need to be on the side of this progressive ideology, this cultural Marxist ideology.
Yeah.
What are the consequences? I know that this is something that a lot of Christians are thinking about, and they're trying to wrap their head around it as a comprehensive worldview, as a system of ideas. But it feels slippery sometimes. Like even if you're paying attention to the news, it feels like it's hard to really define this, and it's even harder to maybe imagine the consequences of what would happen if we allowed this ideology to sort of permeate everything. I'm just curious. You've probably spent a lot of time thinking about that. What would the consequences be if we if woke ideology just triumphed and attained all those goals that you're talking about?
That's right. I think people don't really understand how many things are tied to this worldview. And it's a worldview, right? So in the same way that our Christian worldview or a Muslim worldview or a New Age worldview expresses itself throughout all of our decisions in every facet of our lives, it touches on everything, so does wokeness. So here are a few examples. So number 1, wokeness by nature tears down all norms, including sexual norms. This is why we see LGBTQ plus affirmation tied so tightly into wokeness, because on their view, things like the gender binary or heterosexism, meaning the idea that that male and female were meant to marry and have kids, and that's how society propagates, that those ideas are oppressive. We have to tear them down, which is why we see the normalization of all kinds of sexual identities and expressions, because that's a way to show that we're to stand up against these oppressive narratives that we think are false and are just there to privilege straight white men. So that's what we're seeing it's a field of critical theory called queer theory that very much tries to tear down all sexual and gender norms. Another way we see it expressed is through pro-choice activism, because feminists for a long time have been saying that you cannot be feminist and not stand for reproductive freedom, by which they mean right to abortion. So that's seen to limit women's reproductive health, meaning access to abortion, is seen as a way that patriarchy perpetuates its power. They would say that a pro-life movement is actually really about perpetuating male power and dominance over women's bodies, especially black women. So we see pro-choice activism increasingly couched in the language of intersectional feminism. Another major field that's not really part of the culture wars per se is the erosion of meritocracy, because critical theorists think all norms are really the way to justify the power of the ruling class. So they would be very skeptical of anything like standardized testing or merit-based anything, because they would see merit as a way that the ruling class defines themselves as having merit and putting other people down and marginalizing them. This is why we see schools, universities, businesses getting rid of any objective measurement standard, because they're seen as biased, racist, patriarchal, etc. So, and I could go on and on, but there are a myriad of ways in which woke thinking, we don't even realize it's woke, but it's really coming from disciplines like critical pedagogy, queer theory, critical race theory. These are permeating everything we talk about today. And that's why it's so important, Christians, you have to understand these ideas so you can spot them in the wild.
Right. You could almost say a unifying theme is just reality is kind of silly putty for this postmodern belief. And it has that in common with Marxism. You know, you read about, I mean, it's weird. Those two, the vibes are very different. You know, the gulag versus like activists on a college campus or something. Yeah. You know, at first you think they're different, but you read about some of what they attempted under the influence of Marxism 100 years ago in, say, the USSR, where they're planting crops in the winter and just trying to mold reality. They even had the Russian sexual revolution in the 1920s, where they had completely abolished marriage. And we've tried these ideas
bourgeois norms,
Yes, let's abolish. These are just norms. They're not embedded in reality. And as Christians, we have to disagree with that, because we believe in a God who created reality, and he created these norms. They're not socially constructed.
Right.
One of the lines that you wrote, Neil, that I have a quote document. I just pulled this straight from your Gospel Coalition article straight into my quote document. You said, much of modern politics has more to do with metaphysics than with the wisdom of marginal tax rates.
Yeah.
Could you unpack that a little more? Because these discussions are inevitably political. And I know we're hitting on it some, but I think it's worth clarifying. They're not just political, are they? Like, we really are talking about something that has a political edge, but it's more about the clash of ideas. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. In our books, we always say our primary concerns are theological, right? This is not primarily about how you should vote, who you should vote for. It's not about that. It's primarily about getting our theology right, especially as Christians. We want to get our heads on straight theologically. But if we do that, we'll inevitably notice that a lot of the policies, prescriptions are actually being made by different politicians are rooted in their worldview, in their metaphysics. So take a policy about transgender athletes, right? That's not just political. Oh, it's just a matter of what's best for society. Well, define best. Define gender, define woman. You have to define all these terms and ask yourself, what's society for? What are human beings? What is gender? You don't have policy discussions in a vacuum. So I would love it if the two parties today, or third parties, if they're all arguing over something sort of much more mundane, like how much should we tax people, or should we have tariffs or not? But they're asking it at root much more fundamental questions like, does gender exist? Are there only two of them? What is a human being? We can't avoid answering those questions. You know, because I said I don't want to get political, and we don't initially, but you have to see how these ideas have deep political implications that are unavoidable today.
Right. Something at Summit, when we talk about marriage and the family, something that we teach our students is design first and then legislation.
Yeah.
So we got to think about what is the design. And actually, Neil, like, to me, that feels like good news, because political discussions right now, I think we got to have them. I think we need to be faithful, but they feel so loaded. But talking about design, hey, like, just putting aside policy for a second, do you think the universe is designed? Do you think men and women have a design? To me, there's a glimmer of hope in how we have these conversations with our friends and neighbors, that it touches on the political, but maybe we could just dial it back and just talk about like, hey, what do you think about humanity? I wanted to ask you, on that note, what are practical ways that Christians can have these conversations without, I don't know, stepping on some landmine that's going to explode their relationship? Yeah, I think that's a lot of our fear, right? This is difficult stuff. What are some practical ways we can get into these conversations?
So right off the bat, listen. No matter who you're talking to, Christian, non-Christian, James says to be slow to speak, quick to listen, slow to become angry. So all this is for everybody all the time, not just for white men, but for black women, Hispanic men, everyone. Listen, and then ask people questions like, well, what do you believe? Tell me about not just your politics, but your religious beliefs and your philosophical beliefs. Like, how do you live your life? So and then listen, and when possible, affirm things. If they say things like, I really care about justice, say, I do too. I believe justice is really important in life. It's part of the reality that God designed, and God commands us to seek true justice. So when you can't affirm that, you may have to then challenge later, well, but how do you define justice? That's great, but at least you can affirm, hey, or I really care about racism. I hate it. It's a terrible scourge in society. And you could say, I do also hate racism. I hate it because I'm a Christian who believes that all men and women of all races were created in God's image, and that we're called to love everyone regardless of ethnicity or race but you can affirm that, yes, I also do not like racism, and my hatred of racism is grounded in my belief it's a sin as a Christian. So that's number one, listen. If you're talking to non-Christians, I would do exactly what you said, which is go back to fundamentals before launching into a discussion of, should biological men be allowed in women's locker rooms. Before you go right there, go back and ask questions like this. Does truth even exist? Does morality even exist? What is justice? Like you say, I care about social justice. Okay, great, but what is justice? And again, listen to their answers. What I would say too is that once you listen to their answers, you can often point out the tensions in their worldviews. They might say something like this. They might say something like, I don't believe there's objective absolute morality. I don't believe in that, but I do care about justice. I want everyone has their own truth. They have their truth. I have my truth, but I really care about the marginalized. Well, point out to them your core assumptions, your beliefs are actually in conflict. For example, what if I said to you, well, my truth is that I don't like the marginalized. My truth is that the marginalized should be sterilized. We should get rid of them and have eugenics and create a civilization where everyone is beautiful and smart. That's my truth. You have your truth. I have my truth. I'm pro-racism. They'll say, wait, you can't do that. Yes, exactly. See, what you're saying is there is objective truth. There are objective standards of right and wrong and good and evil that you do think I should be bowing to. And I agree. But that is with a Christian worldview, that makes sense. Within your secular worldview, it does not. So again, go back to those fundamental questions that they're asking and point out and to identify the tensions between their affirmed beliefs and how they really only make sense within a Christian worldview. If you're talking to Christians, though, and there are Christians who are woke, who have embraced both Christianity and these woke ideas, there again, you want to point out that there's a tension. So sort of asking them things like, well, do you believe the Bible's inerrant? Do you think, what is our fundamental problem as human beings? Fundamentally, I'm not saying that injustice and racism and these are problems, but our fundamental problem, that's sin, right? And the fundamental solution, I agree, we should work to create a just society. We should fight evil. I get that. But fundamentally, the solution to sin is Jesus. It's not doing better, trying harder, doing the work. It's actually submitting and trusting in the Savior. So, and then you can often, if you start there and get them on the same page theologically with really basic Christian beliefs, from then you can unfold problems between what wokeness would have them believe and do and what Jesus would have them believe and do, because they're often in conflict. Just example would be something like, the Bible says God created male and female in his image, and that the gender binary, two categories, are his design for humanity. Therefore, we cannot agree with critical theorists that the gender binary is oppressive. That's just not true. It's actually good, and it helps us flourish. Or another example of how critical theorists believe that your social location or lived experiences will give you insight into reality that oppressors won't have. And you can say, wait a minute, that's not a good hermeneutic for reading the Bible. So you can't say, if I say to you, well, the Bible teaches that the gender binary is good, you can't say, well, that's your straight white male interpretation. So you see that will lead you to all kinds of bad theology. If I say, I believe in the Trinity, well, that's your Western interpretation. Or I believe in the atonement. No, that's your male interpretation. No. We don't ask whether interpretations come from a certain identity group. We ask whether they're true or false, right? And that can't be known by simply saying, well, the guy who said that is a straight white male. Well, sure, but there are black women who say the same thing. Are they wrong too? Oh, that's a good point. So just point out to them that the things that they're told to believe, if they believe critical theory, are antithetical at a very deep level to what the Bible teaches us to believe. So again, depending who you're talking to, listen, but then put a pebble in their shoe, as Greg Koukl says. Put a stone in their shoe and show them that they often have these conflicting beliefs that don't really match well.
And in your book, Neil, you list 15 different practices for how to approach, like 15 different almost disciplines that we can engage in as Christians to get ready to approach those conversations. I'm just curious, what would you say to Christians who are just discouraged? Maybe they tried this one time and it just like blew up in their faces, or they just got mad and the other person got mad. And I guess maybe the feeling that I'm sensing in Christian circles is discouragement with our ability to reach our neighbor on this. It feels like the chasm is so wide. I'm just curious from your experience, from what you've seen, from what the Lord's teaching you in Scripture, like what would you say to a discouraged Christian in this field?
The first thing I'd say is remember that your call is to be faithful to God and not to change their response to you. You can't control their response to you. I mean, even Jesus had many people who rejected his message. It's not on him. And the apostles were put in jail and beaten and tortured. They didn't say, oh, I failed. They said, I've succeeded if I have told the truth in a kind and gracious way. That's all it's on me. God says to them and to us, well done, good and faithful servant, if we simply obey. So that's number one. Take courage, take heart that God's not judging you on the outcome. God's judging you on your obedience and faithfulness. And of course, attitude. You want to do it in love. Second, play the long game. God's not looking to solve every problem in the next 10 minutes or the next election cycle. He's looking at eternity. And so, sure, the person that you talk to may have rejected your claims and rejected you, and maybe they stopped being friends with you, and it was terrible and it hurt your feelings. Sure, I get it. But maybe you planted the seeds that God will water and eventually will cause them to change. And in my own life, for years now, I've been doing this for a long time, and there are many people that I warned about these ideas, and I pleaded with them. I said, this is bad. It's going to lead you in a bad path. And they hated it. They called me racist. They rejected me. But then 3 or 4 years later, I had to get an email saying, hey, I want to apologize. You were right after all. I'm sorry how I treated you. I say, of course, hey, don't even worry about it. Water under the bridge. But just take God's perspective. Play the long game. And keep loving. Don't turn away. Don't harden yourself. Keep loving. Keep being gracious. And pray that God would use your words to bless them and to wake them up if they're wrong.
Yeah, that's a great word, Neil. And man, I think about, in a generation, what are the victims of these bad ideas? We talk about ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. What are the victims of these bad ideas going to say to the Christians who could have said something but didn't? Or, even in just that faithfulness vein, not trying to change the world, but like, what if I could have spoken up at my workplace?
There's an example in our book that's a really helpful way to connect to young people. I think a lot of young Gen Zers who are woke or very attracted to wokeness, woke ideology, they want to change the world, fight on the right side of history, all that stuff. And they're all about compassion. Well, see, critical theorists, the progressives, they sound compassionate. You sound like a hateful bigot. You're only about hatred and all these negative things, and they're all about positivity and inclusion. One of the things that's really effective for reaching them is pointing out that compassion, real compassion, is always tethered to truth. The example that we give in the book, it's very powerful, is the example of detransitioners. These are often young women who at some point in life decided that they were men and they would transition to men and they would take hormones, sometimes have surgeries, and then only later to discover that this was not working and to go back to their true gender. And this is what they're called detransitioners. There's a growing movement of these young women, also young men. But one of the things they say is, where were the people willing to speak the truth to me? And my entire adolescence, I was only given affirmation. Oh, that's right. You really are a man. Don't let anyone tell you different. Don't let the haters get to you. You're a man. You're beautiful. Cut off your breasts and do all these surgeries and take the hormones. But no one, in their own words, they said, no one loved me enough to tell me the truth. These people claim to love me, but what they did to me was they ruined my life. They hurt me badly. So that's a check on our impulse to just affirm everybody and all their choices.
Yeah.
If you love people truly, you will tell them the truth in love. And if you're lying to them, because you're not loving them, you're loving yourself. You're loving your own complacency, your own comfort. So we have to keep their actual good in mind, which is not necessarily what they think is good for them right now. And we know this all day. If you have kids, you know they're begging for candy. They want to eat 18 Snickers bars. It's 11 o'clock at night. And you say, if you do that, you're going to be miserable tomorrow. And you hate me. You don't love me. If you love me, you let me eat this candy. And you say, honey, I love you. And that's why I can't do this. If you see an anorexic girl who says, you have to tell me I'm fat and call me fatty because I know I'm fat. You don't. And if you don't tell me I'm fat, it's because you don't love me. And you say, honey, you are anorexic. And it's because I love you. It's because I love you, I will not call you fatty or tell you that you're fat. It's not in spite of my love for you. It's because I love you. And we have to do that. We have to be willing to be called names for the sake of telling them the truth in love.
Yeah, man, that's such a good point, Neil. Like, it is. It's often our lack of courage. It's often my lack of courage that trips me up in these conversations, and my lack of love for my neighbor. I want to love more. I want to love better, and be willing to press into these conversations. You mentioned children. I think that's a perfect segue. A lot of our listeners are parents, and it's a harrowing age to bring forth children and raise them. What's your advice to parents? How can they equip their children to see these ideas, given that they are everywhere?
So one thing I just say is buy our book. We wrote this book that I think the number one target audience for this book were parents with kids who are, middle school, high school, entering the age where they're going to be sent out into the world. We wrote this book a large part to you, parents, to equip you to understand these ideas that your kids will be exposed to. I don't care where they go to school, whether they just go right into the workplace, whether they go to a secular school, state school, elite school, Christian school, they will encounter wokeness everywhere at some point. So you need to understand what they're encountering. In our book, we actually have a sort of a collective an example. It's a fictional, but we tell a story of Emily, who goes to college out of her Christian conservative home, enters state school to become a social work major, and we sort of narratively tell the story of how she slowly gets pulled away from her conservative Christian upbringing, and because she's being bombarded by this woke messaging. And we've seen it happen, frankly, in people that we know and love. And so, we want to equip you. And so how do you talk to your kids? I'd say a couple things. One is start by talking to them about the reality of things like historical racism, slavery, Jim Crow. Talk about present-day racial disparities. Talk about the Me Too movement, actual sexual abuse that happens. Of course, this is for older kids. But my point is this. Don't leave them in the dark. Don't shelter them so much. The first time they ever hear about slavery is from a Sociology 101 secular professor who's going to teach them that Christianity is a white man's religion at the same time. You have to inoculate them against these ideas by telling them sometimes the hard truth about our country and about reality so that they analyze, they interpret all those facts from a Christian perspective. That's number one. You do not let your kids get to college never having heard about racism, slavery, sexism, never having really understood the LGBTQ movement or its claims. I'm not saying affirming it at all. I'm saying understanding there are people out there who identify this way, who live this way, And what are their arguments? You can't shelter them so much that they get to the college or the workplace and it's brand new to them. They'll ask themselves, wait, there are all these things I was never exposed to as a kid. What else were they hiding? So you want to, again, inoculate them, expose them to it within the confines, the safe confines of your church environment, of your family. Help them work through how to understand these phenomenon as a Christian. That's just number one. And then I'd make that compassion and truth point. That the main draw of wokeness, especially for young kids, is its purported compassion. But remind them that real compassion is rooted in the truth. You can be very compassionate for someone who's sick and give them poison because you're not a doctor. You thought it would help them. They asked for it, so you gave it to them, and it killed them. Well, so to be truly compassionate, you need to do what's actually best for them, that means you have to prioritize what's true over what feels good.
Right. What a moment for Christian education. Whether you're homeschooling or whether you are involved in a Christian school or you're just a parent, right? This is our calling to educate the next generation, and we have to go above and beyond in that. It's not enough to just teach them, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Like, it's almost like worldview education is mandatory in order to hold on to our faith, given these challenges that are coming our way. But I think that's so good, Neil, and especially the piece about just thinking about teaching them about the evil in the world. Christians have a category for that already.
Yeah.
We shouldn't believe the straw man argument that progressive ideologies lob at us, which is that you have no idea. You don't know what the real world is like. Listen to us. That is so not true. I'm reading Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov, for the first time. Missed that somehow up till now. But he, in the 40s, he's a strong Christian, and his characters are outlining in depth, in detail, the problem of suffering and evil. Yeah. He's not pulling any punches. This is our heritage as Christians, to take the suffering in the world seriously. And we've never been on team just write it off. We're actually on team, this grieves God's heart. Yeah. And we have a solution to it that's better than just pitting different groups of people against each other. What for you, what are some, I don't know if there's been passages of scripture or elements of Christian history, Neil, what about our heritage as Christians in scripture and elsewhere is calling out to you right now as a resource that we need to make sure the next generation holds on to as an educator, as a dad, I would even say as a scientist too. I mean, you're looking at the natural world, we have all these riches in Christ and in God who created this world. What are you pulling on with your kids when you teach them about a Christian worldview?
It's going to sound trite, but I think just the gospel itself is so revolutionary. It's the power of God unto salvation for all who believe, but it's also just a powerful story. Like you said, talk about making sense of the evil in the world, but also the beauty, making sense of our need for righteousness, our longing for something that we can't put our finger on, which is ultimately justification. We want to know that we are forgiven, that we're right in a deep sense of the word. All those needs and desires and longings are fulfilled by the gospel. 2 Corinthians 5:21, that God made him sin who knew no sins, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Just the idea that, so how does that play out with this discussion? One place I would go to is just how much of critical theory or wokeness is ultimately works righteousness. It's this endless treadmill of trying to prove yourself good, that you're on the right side of history, you're not a bigot. You're not like those guys over there, the robbers, the evildoers, tax collectors, prostitutes, bigots, haters, Republicans. You're better than them. What is that? That is a way to justify yourself. It all goes back to that. All of human history, in some way or another, is a way for us to be autonomous, but especially in feeling we can make our own good. We can declare ourselves good. But why are we doing that? Because we know we're not good. That's the deep down inside. We know that we are naked and helpless and we need something. And so just preaching the gospel to my kids every day and assuring them that this is how you can find what you both deeply need and subconsciously know you need. It fulfills all of that. that is a shield against all the ideologies out there that are trying to convince them there's another way. There's another way to feel right. Whether it's kissing cathedral steps and buying indulgences, or it's reading Robin DiAngelo books and putting up yard signs, or it's keeping the law of Allah very, very hard and strictly, and that's how you can know. It's just confessing and trusting in the Savior God provided. That to me will always be the biggest part of the biggest apologetic, the biggest hope, the biggest argument for Christianity being true.
It's so true. It's so good. And it strikes me as really necessary too, because I was going to ask you too, we have this woke progressive ideology on the left, but we've talked on this podcast about there's some reaction happening on the right as well, where maybe just young people feeling just burdened by the heavy weights that have been heaped upon them at their schools and universities. They're kicking back and they're actually just, okay, Duke's up. Let's go. You want to play that game? Let's play that game. I guess a question I would have, and you don't want to morally equivocate. In some ways, this is definitely coming from the political left. Do you see a danger from, I guess you could just broaden it and say, alternative sources of trying to fight woke ideology that creates a danger for this next generation?
There is. I think I said the data does show, I think unequivocally, that the Gen Zers are not all based. This narrative on some conservative spaces that all Gen Z, they're so based, they reject all this.
Right.
That's not what the data actually says. Unfortunately, there's not this dramatic religious revival. Anecdotally, there's some churches seeing some growth, but as a whole, the data is pretty clear that no, Gen Z is the least religious generation in history. So I don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you the data actually say that.
Right.
So don't lose hope. God is a God who rescues people and brings people back. But I'm just saying, don't take this false and triumphalistic approach to the younger generation. And there is a danger, obviously, of them just embracing the progressive left and woke ideology, this worldview, which is false. But there is this reactionary movement that's small, but of people rejecting anything that even smells like wokeness, to the point where they're now, we're having debates over among Christians, over whether interracial marriage is okay. I mean, I kid you not. I had to do an interview with Sean McDowell about this just last week. They're purportedly evangelical Christians who are now getting confused about interracial marriage. Is racism even a sin? I'm like, I can't believe I'm discussing this. In our book, actually, we had to devote an entire section to these topics, because the bottom line is you can have an unbiblical view of race, whether you're on the left or on the right, but they're both unbiblical, right? We don't want to side mindlessly with either side of the political spectrum. We want to side with the Bible. Now, that truth will be, frankly, on the right a lot of the time, but that's not what we're about. We are about being square on the Bible, and that will occasionally put us at odds with both the right and the left. So yeah, I do think it's a danger, but the solution is very simple. Just learn what the Bible teaches about race, gender, and sexuality, and that's the point of our book. Right.
So well said. Yeah. I want to ask another question. So a lot of Christians working in secular workplaces, they're still having to deal with DEI policies. And for them, I mean, there is a cost to holding to a Christian worldview with any level of firmness. What would you say to folks who are fearful they might lose their job if they speak out? The shifting tides of culture hasn't reached them, where they're at. What would you say to Christians who are in that place? What can they do?
I would say speak up early rather than later. Be proactive, not reactive. Don't wait until your company institutes a mandatory pronoun policy and then speak out. Speak out now and say, hey, I have questions about how this would impact me. This thing that I see in the future, maybe. How are we handling that as a company? You can always stand on what the Bible says about these things and say, well, the Bible, as a Christian, the Bible teaches this. But be careful, because the company might say, well, why we don't believe the Bible, right? It's not part of our policy. So you might hit a dead end there. I think it's more fruitful to appeal to values the company already espouses. You can say on paper, look, your company claims to value diversity. Yes, we do. It's a workplace value. Okay, then you should value diversity of ideology, ideological diversity. You should be willing to embrace people of all different political beliefs. Are you going to stand on that? When that's the case, then you can't say, I can't be part of this company or I'm going to get in trouble for saying things that half of America says too. If you want to say, well, that those are wrong things, I would say, well, then you're making an ideological purity test, even a religious purity test, part of your company's values. Do you want to do that? So, and you often have rights. I mean, there are laws about companies not being allowed to discriminate politically, religiously against various groups. So you can often look up your rights as a employee and say, I actually have these rights to I think they're called sincerely held religious beliefs. That's one thing. And you can say, I don't want that just for me as a Christian. I want everybody at this company to be able to believe what they believe and to not be held to some ideological purity test. So that's one thing. You could talk about free speech. Ask your boss, if the company pass a policy that demanded that I must refer to President Donald Trump as our dear leader. Like, if you don't refer to Trump as our dear leader, Donald Trump, you will be fired. They say, well, I would never do that. We'd never impinge on your right to free speech. Great. Then you should not require me to use preferred pronouns, because that's compelled speech too, right? If you'd be against the one, you should be against the other. So you can often make these arguments that appeal to their espoused corporate values. Another one would be inclusion. Are you really about inclusion? Oh, of course we are. We have a DEI department. Great. Are you going to include religious Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Christians who would all say the gender binary exists and is a good thing? Or are we going to exclude those undesirables? And they can frame it as we're holding you accountable to your own professed standards. And that approach is often more fruitful than just saying, well, the Bible says it. I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm just saying that will make often more headway. If you want a great book on this topic, Helen Pluckrose is an atheist progressive, but she's very anti-woke and wrote the book Cynical Theories with James Lindsay, who many people know. But she wrote a recent book called The Counterweight Handbook, which is a how-to manual for getting DEI out of your workplace. And she appeals to purely sort of classically liberal values and shows you just practical steps like find a community of like-minded people within your company, find people who are willing to speak out with you, get a good relationship with your manager, get to know them well, look up your rights as an employer, look up your federal legal rights, look at the company policy. Do they have actual on-the-book protection for your beliefs? Things like that. It's very practical. We cite it in our book and summarize it. But like I said, I would appeal to their professed values first and hold them accountable to their own claims before you want to hold them accountable to what the Bible teaches, which is fine. But oftentimes we'll just roll right off their backs because they don't care about the Bible.
Right. That's a great point, Neil. It reminds me of when Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians, he says, we've renounced secret and shameful ways. We don't distort the truth, nor do we practice deception. Instead, commending ourselves, speaking the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And to me, when you talk about being proactive, that's what I think of, like be proactive. Sneakery really isn't our best method here. And I think a lot of Christian schools and institutions that maybe aren't churches per se, but they've had legal action brought against them for not adhering to these DEI policies. They've learned that the hard way. Yeah. We weren't clear that we're believers and that impacts everything we do. So being proactive is such a good takeaway from that. We're running low on time. Unfortunately, I could talk about this stuff all day, and I want to thank you, Neil Shenvi. Just your approach brings so much more light than heat. It brings a little bit of action step, but so many of these discussions sometimes they bring more heat than light. And something I've appreciated about your writing over the years is just the way that you're able to elucidate exactly where the problem is with these ideas. I guess I would end with this question. So in your book, you end by saying we need to do three things. We got to speak out against critical theory in the public square. Number two, we need to keep critical theory out of the church. We can't let it sneak in the back door. And number three, we need to trust in God's sovereignty, love, and power. And I'm curious for you, is there an example of believers in your life or that you see out there who are doing that really well that you would point to as a model for Christians right now?
Sure, there are any number of evangelicals who are out there in the public square trying to make changes. I have a friend from church who's running for his school board that, and he's going to bring his Christian worldview to the school board. So do that. If you don't want to run for office, we'll just join the PTA, Parent Teachers Association. Go to a school board meeting, speak out. If there's bathroom policies being discussed, say, no, I don't think we should have women in men's bathrooms, and here are the reasons why. So, but get involved. It's not just about pulling a lever every 4 years. You should be, when I say public square, people think, oh, voting? Well, that's just a tiny bit of it. Talk to your neighbors, get to know them. Them. They have a transgender identified daughter and they're desperate for opinions that don't come from The View or from the Facebook moms group that urge them to put their daughter on hormones. They might be longing for someone to speak truth to them, and you can be that person. For the church, talk to your pastor. I had tons of emails from people coming to me and say, how can I talk to my pastor? And well, that's why I wrote the book. I mean, you can buy the book. We'll give you a good, and then you can buy the book and buy a second copy for your pastor and give it to him and say, read this. It'll help you navigate these issues. And then finally, I would just say, whatever you do, however you go into the public square, obey Jesus' commands. Love your enemy, turn the other cheek, speak with truth and kindness and gentleness, no matter who you're talking to. Don't forsake the Bible's clear commands about how we're to advocate for truth and confuse that with just winning. If you win by disobeying Jesus, you have not won. Real winning is obedience to God and trusting that he is in charge of the outcome. So I'd close with that because I do see a lot of people as being so angry, they're like, win at all costs. I'm like, no, not at all costs. Win within God's commands, because that's what we're called to do. I'm not going to sin, and winning is not sinning, and sinning is not winning. That's a stupid phrase, but it captures the idea that we are first and foremost Christians, and that has to be the lens through which we see everything, including politics.
Yes. Yeah. Well said. Dr. Neil Shenvi, thank you so much for coming on the Truth Changes Everything podcast. It's been a joy.
Yeah, my pleasure, Casey. Thank you so much for inviting me.
A huge thank you to our guest, Neil Shenvi, for coming on the show. You can go to shenviapologetics.com to find more of his resources, and I would highly recommend you do so. He is incredible and an incredible resource in our day and age. This has been a podcast of Summit Ministries. We exist to come alongside the rising generation, their trainers, parents, and influencers so that young people can know God's truth and become champions of a biblical worldview. To learn more about Summit or get resources to help the young people in your life embrace and share the truth that changes everything, you can go to summit.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.